Hello there, and welcome back to Hydroponics Daily, your go-to podcast for everything soilless cultivation. In yesterday's episode, we talked about manipulating flower colour, especially in cut flowers and flower crops, bud crops and things like this. And then today we're going to talk about cut flower production in greater detail. So yesterday was just about flower colour manipulation, and today we'll talk about how you grow a flower crop, how you harvest it, and things like this. Well, maybe not how you harvest it, but pest and disease and hydroponics. So we're going into the colourful world of cut flower production. From chrysanthemums to tulips, Proteas to lisianthus, more growers around the world are blossoming indoors with hydroponics. So we'll explore the tricks of the trade. Okay, so why shift from soil cultivation to hydroponics, which has happened over the last 25 years in cut flower production? Well, the first thing is for year-round production, independent of soil and independent of the weather. Precise control over nutrients, water, pH and environment, all very common reasons why you would move to hydroponics in any type of crop, but especially in flower production. And then higher yields consistently, longer vase life, which is not what we often think about with hydroponics, and better flower quality. So the flowers are grown in a number of countries around the world, but there are specialist hotspots. And then particular areas are Holland, Colombia, Kenya, South Africa, and Kunming in China. And also Spalding in Lincolnshire. That's a big one for cut flowers here in the UK. So yeah, on almost every continent there is one particular area that's particularly adept at growing flowers. There's and because you need highly skilled workers to produce cut flower production, you need a lot of water, you need high light levels and low temperatures. You haven't got high light levels in Spalding, but we'll go on to that, why that's particularly good. So flower types that are now being grown hydroponically include roses, which are probably one of the biggest cut flowers, I would imagine. Chrysanthemums, very popular in Japan. Gerberas, lisianthus, lilies, proteas, orchids, and all the bulb species. So basically any type of cut flowers, I think, is apart from ones maybe on trees, but like hydrangeas, any shrub-based ones. Chrysanthemums and gerberas, often grown in NFT or ebb and flood troughs. They require they're short day plants requiring less than 12 hours. So chrysanthemums used to be an autumn cut flower in the UK. And now they're all year round because you can create short days by basically making a mini grow tent inside the greenhouse and cutting out all sunlight. And then you can extend the day length with just normal incandescent bulbs. You don't need LEDs, you don't need sodium luminaires or HPSs. You just can use incandescent or fluorescent lights. So that's how you grow chrysanthemums indoor in greenhouses. Other crops that used to be specific or still are, dahlias. You could only get dahlias for weddings in May, I think, in the UK. So if you could produce them hydroponically, you'd run through a winner because brides love dahlias and they are prepared to pay a premium for dahlias. So if you could set up a hydroponic dahlia farm in the UK or anywhere in Europe, you could make a killing. Roses and lisianthus, they're often grown in deep water culture troughs. Balance of nutrients is essential for quality of the stem and the petal. Highlight regimes boost the anthocyanin pigments in the petals, as we talked about yesterday. Interestingly, though, variety is very important when it comes to cut flowers. Not just because people want certain colours, or not just because some people want scent, but the way a cut flower looks, a rose, is dramatically different in different countries. In the UK and I think in America, we want a closed rose and not too long a stem. Because you think of that as good value for money, because the consumer thinks, oh, the rose will open up eventually. I want them just as they're opening. The roses never do open up. They're not early on. And so, whereas we just think of that, that's where we've been accustomed to buy roses. Whereas in Russia, cut flowers for Russia, the roses have to be more open and the stem's much longer because that's what the customer demands in Russia. Interesting, isn't it? Lilies and orchids, they're cultivated in perlite filled troughs or hydro substrate bags. A lot of bark for orchids, for the epiphytic orchids, the ones that normally grow in the trees. Temperature control is critical to the initiation phase of flowering in both of these species, lilies and orchids. Temperature, you've got to get the right cool treatments and the right high temperatures. That is even more the case in bulbs like tulips, daffodils, and hyacinths. You can force these into flowering in hydroponic troughs with temperature phasing, warmth for flower initiation, then 8 to 12 degrees Celsius to extend the stem and the spike. And this mimics the traditional forcing, but improves the speed and efficiency. So that's interesting. Proteas, which are a very high value cut flower associated with the South African flora, the fynbos flora of the Cape, highly valued in Africa and Australia. Do they grow in Australia? I'm not sure. Any Australian listeners, please let me know. Do proteas grow in Australia? I know the South African rugby football team. Their nickname is the Proteas. I forgot their. No, they're Springboks. Sorry, I'm talking absolute nonsense. The cricket team of South Africa are called the Proteas. Anyway, regardless of which sports team are called the Proteas are a South African flower. They're grown in coarse, well-drained substrates with acidified, low EC hydroponic feeds. That's because Proteas can be killed by high phosphorus levels. They grow in very phosphorus-deficient soil, and so they've evolved not to have mycorrhiza on their roots, but to just acidify the soil. And if you give them they've adapted to absorb as much phosphorus from the environment as possible. You give them too much phosphorus, it will kill them. They might look pale yellow, but they definitely don't give them an NPK fertilizer. You have to be really careful with your nutrition when it comes to Proteas. Interesting fact about Proteas, you think of the big king Proteas, the really big flowers. There are actually lots of different species, and there's one that has the flowers, rather than being pointing up at the sun, they grow at the bottom of the shrub and they point downwards towards the soil. And they are pollinated by rodents, little rats and mice that run across the fynbos flora and they take the pollen with them. So a really interesting pollen mechanism there. Whoever thought of it? Rodent pollination. Very, very sensitive to root rot. So you have to be really careful there. Requires strict quality water and good drainage. But if you can grow Proteas hydroponically, it's a license to print money. As is, what did I say? Dahlias. My wife has banned me from saying the phrase, a license to print money, because I say it so often when I come up with a new product that she thinks we would be living in a lot nicer house and sending our kids to private school and going on much nicer holidays if I really had invented a license to print money every other week. Yeah, I launched 4 new products today, interestingly. So I'll talk about them at the end of this podcast. 4 new licenses to print money. Anyway, chrysanthemums, as we said, they need less than 12 hours of uninterrupted darkness to flower. Any stray light delays harvest and your profits. So that's why the enclosures have to be completely light sealed, no light leak at all. The temperature-sensitive bulbs, daffodils, hyacinths, tulips, as we say, warm induction and cool elongation. And then other species like Cineraria, calceolaria, tropical orchids prefer cool initiation. Phalaenopsis requires 18 to 22 degrees Celsius for flowering, but won't tolerate cold temperatures below 15 degrees Celsius, which is not cool for most species. We talked about colour intensity in Lysianthus or Eustoma yesterday, so we can ignore that. We talked about hydrangea, pH. So there, as I say, the geographical hotspots, the Netherlands and Colombia, they're where most roses and chrysanthemums are grown. Used to be a lot of chrysanthemums grown on the south coast of England. I went to a chrysanthemum grower in about 2002, and they were still growing in soil then. But the problem is that they were just building up nematode levels year after year, and the growers were getting old, pensioners. They weren't going to pass it on to their kids because it wasn't as profitable as it was for those growers back in the 70s and 80s when they were really making big bucks, and they could use really harsh chemicals to kill the nematodes. And so they didn't have the capital invested and they hadn't keep hold of that money to invest into hydroponic systems, so they just went out of business, and the Dutch and the Colombians and the Kenyans took over when it came to rose cultivation. There are still a few cut flower production down on the south coast of England. In soil, there are, I'm trying to think now, there is a guy who grows Alströmerias, my father's favourite flower at the moment, Crosslands Nursery. and they grow in soil, and they don't use any pest control, and they get a few caterpillars and things like this, but it would appear that alstroemerias are pretty tough and resistant to soil-borne pest and disease because they are able to do it in the soil, but most cut flowers are not. So Kenya and Ethiopia was, to say, very high altitude, so high light levels, but cool temperatures. So roses and proteas thrive there. Japan, they grow, obviously, chrysanthemums and orchids. And then Kunming in China. So that's, what province is that? Is that Yunnan province? Off the top of my head. Let me have a look. It's a very high city. It's a very big city in China, as most cities are. And it's very up in the mountains, sort of like Western China, not Tibet, but fairly close to it. Yeah, it's a modern capital and transportation hub of China's southern province, Yunnan. Yeah, there you go. Check out my Chinese knowledge. I know my capitals and my provinces. So yeah, that is, the Chinese wear a lot of flowers, and they'll be imported into Europe from there. I think Flamingo is a big importer of them into Europe as a company. So advantages of hydroponics in soil versus soil in cut flowers is obviously the soil pathogens, particularly Fusarium, Pythium, nematodes, cleaner stems because you've not got that soil around, better vase life, longer vase life. If you can automate production, you can use vase life. Less pesticide exposures in theory, but still a lot of pesticides used. And you see horror pictures, videos of Kenyan growers without any gloves dipping the flowers in fungicide before they go off to be sold. So be careful when you're handling cut flowers. Could be exposing yourself to a lot of fungicide. Use gloves. Water and nutrient use more efficient, obviously, and there is big issues in Kenya and I think Tanzania where horticultural nurseries are taking groundwater away from the general population, really, and their cattle and their livestock can struggle to get water. But these big businesses have got big contracts with the governments there, and they get first dibs on the water. You wouldn't believe how often in the world of agriculture and agriculture inputs, the phrase, "I know the brother of the agricultural minister," comes up when it comes to distributors worldwide. That seems to be a common way that certain horticultural and agricultural companies can get their way. Anyway, so photoperiod matters for chrysanthemums. We said they're short day plants. Lisianthus and roses are long day flowers, so they flower in the middle of summer. You can obviously manipulate that by just having extension. You can either extend it with supplementary lighting, and it's going to also increase photosynthesis, or if you don't want to increase photosynthesis, just a little incandescent bulb is more than enough to actually get the plant to think that it's under long days. And then remember that osteospermum and sunflowers only open in full sun. Sunflowers, when they're young, they move with the sun, don't they? But when they're older, they get stuck in a certain position. I think that's right. And then for bulbs and certain orchids, flowering is very important. And bulbs, when we give them warm, cold, then warm, that's known as forcing, bulb forcing to mimic outside conditions. Just as we talked about like rhubarb forcing and chicory forcing and things like this. Basically taking plants indoors, giving them cold treatments and hot treatments is called forcing. What are the growth challenges? Plants can get tall and vulnerable to wind in greenhouses and polytunnels. You'll find a lot of plastic tunnels abroad rather than actual glass houses. You could get root diseases from recirculatory water, so it needs to be filtered and sterilised, and your nutrients will need to be buffered to avoid pH drift. Standard hydroponic issues. Proteas, you would want to reduce your hydroponic medium down to around 5.5 and exclude as much phosphorus as possible. So educate, the root zone matches the natural cape environment as possible, apart from the fact it's covered in water. Future opportunities, definitely dahlias. What else did I say? There was another one. Proteas, if you're going to grow for the UK market. I don't know what the opportunities are in other markets, but there will be ones. Find what is hip and happening in your area. I'd say dahlias definitely. I don't mean dahlias. I mean peonies. Flipping out. Call myself a plant scientist. Take that PhD off me. I mean peonies. Peonies are the ones that you can only get in May. Don't forget about dahlias. They're not going to make you any money. Grow peonies for all year round peonies, and you will absolutely make a fortune in the UK. Yeah, but there will be things like peonies in other countries where there's a they can only get, go and speak to a florist and say, what can you only get at certain times of the year, and try and produce them all year round. Everyone's going on about strawberries. Everyone in hydroponics is obsessed with all year round strawberries. Forget that. Everyone's after strawberries. Get into cut flowers. Go and speak to your florist. See where there's a pain point, and hit that pain point with a solution. There will be opportunities around renewable energy, LED lighting. A lot of these things will not have been optimized for cut flowers because they'll have been optimized for leafy veg first, and then legal cannabis, and cut flowers will be much further down the road. So there's opportunities there. And then breeding for hydroponic adaptability, like dwarf chrysanthemums. And could you use hydroponics to produce hydrangeas of a range of different colours by modifying their pH and things like this? There's loads of different opportunities you could look at. And yeah, so I think cut flowers, if I was getting into hydroponics, wanted to set up a grow, forget leafy veg, forget strawberries, forget potatoes and cotton and all these things that people are looking at. I'd get down to my florist and ask them, apart from peonies, what are you struggling to get at certain times of the year? I'd just go after that. Yeah, there's an easy win there for someone who's got the balls to go and try it, the cojones to go and try it, the gender neutral guts. There you go, the guts. There we go. Right. So that's been Hydroponics Daily for today. I think it's a really interesting area. And I'd love people, if you've got any, you would like to talk about it further, you want to talk about any ideas for cut flower production, if you want to collaborate, then get in touch with me. If you've been shared this podcast, then you owe the person who shared it with you a very, very cold, delicious beer or wine. Not cold wine, but a wine of the right temperature, or an iced lolly if you don't drink alcohol, or an ice cream. Anyway, I'm rambling. That's been Hydroponics Daily for today. I'll speak to you tomorrow, where we'll be talking about nitrogen and different forms of nitrogen that plants can absorb, and the advantages and disadvantages of those different forms of nitrogen. That sounds amazing, doesn't it? Bet you can't wait. Speak to you tomorrow. Goodbye.